Some buildings don't collapse with an explosion. They dim first quietly after someone decides the person who wired them is no longer necessary. That was me. I'll tell you exactly how it happened, step by step. But before I do, tell me something. Where are you listening from? What's the temperature like there right now? If you've ever seen experience dismissed as outdated, you know this story matters. When you subscribe, you help it reach someone who needs that reminder today. I wasn't just a technician in steel-toe boots. I built the plant's load distribution system, the unseen grid, that kept 6 production lines from burning themselves into scrap. I started here 27 years ago as an electrical engineer, and after a near shutdown from thermal overload, I rebuilt the entire balancing network. The safeguards I designed cut downtime by 32% and saved the company millions in peak energy penalties. I was the only one who understood how the power actually moved through this building, not on a dashboard, but in real copper and heat. Derek Vaughn didn't care. 36, VP of Digital Optimization, MBA, perfect haircut, allergic to anything that required a wrench. He loved words like disruption and scalable intelligence. He loved dashboards more than people. In the middle of the executive meeting, he stood up. We don't need instincts. We need automation. 14 managers stared at the polished table. He clicked to the next slide. Legacy overhead is expensive. That was me. Legacy overhead. We're eliminating the position, effective immediately, no warning, no transition plan. I kept my voice steady. Have you reviewed the thermal balancing matrix? He smiled like I'd asked if he'd tried turning it off and on again. We have AI now. Of course they did. I unclipped my badge slowly. The plastic felt warm in my hand. I placed it on the table and walked out without looking back. 8 hours later, plant-wide energy consumption drifted 6% above baseline. No alarms, no smoke, just a quiet imbalance beginning to spread. No one noticed. I did, after that moment. The real story began. Some details that follow are dramatized, with a little creative help from AI, shaped for learning and storytelling. I hope you stay with me through it. And if tonight isn't the night, get some rest. Take care of yourself. I'll be here when you're ready. The humiliation didn't end when I walked out of that conference room. It multiplied. By noon, Derek had IT escort him into the control server suite like he was leading a victory parade. I wasn't there, but Kevin from infrastructure texted me anyway. He's deleting everything, not restructuring, not archiving, deleting. First, they revoked every admin credential tied to my name. 27 years of layered access wiped in under 3 minutes. Then Derek ordered them to remove the manual stabilization protocol, the quiet safety net I built, to smooth sudden load shifts across the lines. That's legacy clutter, he said. We're standardizing. Next. He told them to disable the backup load balancing mode, the one that redistributes power when a line spikes unexpectedly. Redundant. He declared, if AI can't handle it, we shouldn't be running it. I stared at the text thread while sitting at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug I wasn't drinking from. 3 winters ago, I slept in that control room for 72 straight hours when a transformer fault nearly cooked line 3. I ate vending machine crackers and adjusted load manually to keep us from a full shutdown. 2 years ago, I turned down a senior position in Texas that paid 30% more because this team needed stability during a transition. I chose loyalty over relocation. By 3 p.m., Derek was presenting to the board. We just eliminated a 6-figure inefficiency, he said, according to someone who had the decency to forward me the quote, 6-figure inefficiency. That was me now. Late that evening, the system logs, which I could still view publicly through energy reporting feeds, began showing small voltage oscillations across line 2. Nothing dramatic, just uneven fluctuations. The new AI dashboard labeled it Optimization Phase Adaptive Calibration. I knew that pattern. It wasn't optimizing, it was drifting. And nobody in that building understood the difference anymore. The morning didn't feel dramatic. That was the unsettling part. There was no siren, no flashing red alert, no grand cinematic warning, just numbers moving across a dashboard, smooth and obedient. Derek launched what he called smart load compression, with the confidence of a man who believed software always wins. He had sold it to the board as precision efficiency flatten peaks, redistribute draw, optimize performance in real time. On paper, it was elegant, in a live industrial grid. Elegance has to answer to physics. At first, the system behaved, load dipped where expected, current redistributed cleanly across adjacent phases. If you only looked at the top-line metrics, you'd think it was working perfectly. Then the algorithm misread a transient spike on line 2. It treated a momentary fluctuation as sustained demand and recalculated phase allocation too aggressively. Instead of easing current back into balance, it shifted the load angle abruptly, in a financial spreadsheet. That adjustment would have looked like a rounding correction in a 600 horsepower industrial motor. It became heat. For 10 seconds, just 10, the motor received power at the wrong phase alignment. 10 seconds is nothing in a boardroom. 10 seconds inside copper windings is a lifetime. The thermal curve climbed faster than it should have. The protective breaker hesitated, then tripped. There was no explosion, just a low mechanical groan as insulation failed and the motor seized under its own heat. Line 2 went silent. Replacement cost $70,000. Immediate. I sat still at my kitchen table, staring at the live utility feed. The load drop was unmistakable. One heavy consumer gone. Production halted. Within minutes, internal chatter filtered through the industry network I still monitored. Motor failure, unexpected burnout, equipment age. Then I received a log export from someone who hadn't yet learned to look away from inconvenient data. The trace told the real story. The compression protocol initiated redistribution. The system detected a phase inconsistency and recommended reverting to baseline stabilization, the very ceiling I had designed years earlier. Instead of accepting the correction, someone intervened. Manual override initiated, authorized by Dr. Vaughn. The algorithm had hesitated. The safeguard had spoken. Derek had silenced it. Later, I heard he stood above the line and said, "Old equipment failure. It wasn't old equipment. It was new arrogance." The system hadn't rebelled. It had obeyed. That was the quiet truth, humming beneath the surface. And storms don't begin with thunder. They begin with someone deciding a warning doesn't apply to them. After the motor burned out, any rational leader would have paused. Derek did the opposite, by noon. He had convened what he called a rapid stabilization session. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. The plant's public load curve told the story. Instead of reverting to the previous configuration, the one that had kept 6 lines balanced for years, he doubled down on smart load compression. Reverting sends the wrong message. He reportedly said, "We can't be scared of efficiency." Scared of efficiency. That was how he framed caution. The IT team suggested restoring the manual stabilization protocol temporarily, at least until they diagnosed the phase misalignment that fried the motor. Kevin, who still had enough humility to read a log file, pointed out that the thermal sealing logic had flagged a warning before the override. Derek waved it off. "That sealing is throttling performance." He said, "Remove it. Raise the limit. The algorithm needs room to learn." Room to learn. The thermal cutoff I had written wasn't decorative. It capped operating temperature at 92 degrees Celsius because that's where insulation life expectancy began to drop exponentially. It wasn't theory. It was field data from 3 near failures and 1 very expensive mistake in 2009. But Derek didn't see history. He saw resistance. At 1:15, he ordered IT to bypass the temperature ceiling and disable the secondary load balancing buffer that redistributed excess draw during spikes. Both safeguards were labeled in his slide deck as redundant legacy constraints. Kevin hesitated. He asked for written authorization. Derek gave it. "Document it if you want," he said. "But we're not babysitting outdated code." The system adjusted. Without the ceiling, the compression algorithm operated more aggressively. On the dashboard, efficiency ticked up 2%. In the control room, someone probably breathed easier. On my screen at home, the load curve looked wrong. It wasn't spiking dramatically, it was tightening, compressing across narrower margins. That's the kind of change executives celebrate and engineers worry about. At 3 p.m., Line 3 reported minor fluctuations, nothing that triggered an alarm, but enough to show uneven draw across the bus. The backup balancing mode, the one Derek had disabled that morning, would have redistributed that strain automatically. Now it didn't. By 4. The packaging line, Line 5, started drawing heavier current as it ramped to meet a late shipment window. Ford's order was scheduled for evening dispatch. The plant had already lost hours due to the motor replacement. They were pushing, without the buffer. Line 5 pulled directly from the same substation feed that Line 3 had begun stressing earlier. The compression algorithm, still chasing efficiency targets, attempted to equalize across phases again. It did so without the thermal sealing and without the secondary balance mode. At 4:32, the voltage dipped sharply on one segment of the packaging line. Not a full blackout, just enough of a drop to trigger a localized breaker cascade. The conveyor slowed, sensors blinked, automated sorters stalled mid-cycle. Then, half the packaging floor went dark. Local outage, 6 hours after Derek insisted we not be scared. The plant experienced its first partial shutdown beyond Line 2. The loss wasn't dramatic. No sparks, no explosions, just a row of idle machines and a red clock ticking toward missed delivery. Ford doesn't accept explanations about optimization phases. By 5:15, word spread that the shipment window would be missed. Penalty clauses were automatic. Expedited logistics would cost extra. Overtime would spike. From my couch, I watched the utility feed stabilize awkwardly as the breakers reset. The plant limped back online. But the damage was done. Someone forwarded me a short recording from the floor. "Why didn't we just roll it back?" a supervisor asked. Derek's voice answered, sharp and defensive. "Because the hardware failed." That's not a software issue. Blame the hardware. It's amazing how confident people sound when they refuse to see causation. The truth was simpler. He had removed the guardrails and told the car to accelerate. The road hadn't changed. 6 hours after the first $70,000 lesson. The second one arrived quietly missed Ford shipment. Penalty exposure, reputational strain. And still, he refused to revert. That was the most dangerous part. Not the failure. The certainty, after the motor failure and the packaging outage. The building didn't erupt into chaos. That would have been cleaner instead. It simmered. Derek's solution to 2 cascading issues wasn't restraint. It was escalation. If compression had overheated a motor. The problem, in his mind, wasn't compression, it was limitation. The thermal sealing I had written years ago capped system tolerance at 92 degrees Celsius. That number wasn't arbitrary. It was the threshold where insulation life expectancy dropped sharply and compound fatigue accelerated. Derek raised it to 105. On paper, it looked like flexibility. In practice, it was gambling with friction. I watched the public utility draw curve from home, the way you watch storm clouds build over open water. The lines tightened again. The algorithm pushed harder now that it had more room to adapt. There were no alarms, just longer stretches, where the thermal index hovered in the upper 90s. That was the kind of heat that doesn't announce itself loudly. It accumulates inside the plant. Line 3 began cycling faster to compensate for earlier delays. The compression routine redistributed current aggressively, shaving peaks in one place and overfeeding another. The secondary buffer was still disabled. The system no longer had a soft landing. By mid-afternoon, the capacitor bank serving the auxiliary distribution panel began absorbing uneven surges. Capacitors are quiet heroes. They smooth voltage irregularities and stabilize frequency, but they have limits. When you increase allowable temperature by 13 degrees across a grid under strain, you don't eliminate risk. You postpone it. The logs later showed the capacitor cluster exceeding rated tolerance for several consecutive intervals. The algorithm flagged it as within the expanded threshold. That was technically true. Then came the pop. Not a cinematic explosion, just a sharp metallic snap followed by a puff of white vapor as one capacitor in the cluster ruptured under pressure. When a capacitor fails inside a networked bank, the imbalance cascades. The protection relay sensed irregular discharge and triggered an automatic shutdown of the affected distribution branch. Half the floor dimmed. Machines powered down in sequence. Conveyors coasted to a stop. Robotic arms froze mid-motion. The system did what it was designed to do, protect itself from greater damage. But protection has a cost. Production halted again. This time, not just one line, multiple segments went offline as technicians assessed the panel. Even after isolating the damaged capacitor, the grid required gradual restart sequencing to avoid surge feedback. Downtime clocks started. In a Tier 1 automotive facility, every idle minute compounds. The internal accounting team later estimated roughly $3,000 per minute across active lines. Multiply that by the restart delay, inspection cycle, and recalibration window, $210,000 in lost productivity before the floor was stable again. And that didn't include expedited shipping or labor overtime. What struck me most wasn't the shutdown. It was the silence that followed. The plant wasn't screaming. It was waiting. Maintenance crews likely stood around the open panel, the air still faintly smelling of burnt dielectric compound. The AI dashboard probably labeled it something clinical thermal adjustment event. That's what happens when abstraction meets steel. By evening, I heard that Derek framed the capacitor rupture as legacy component fragility. He told department heads that modernization sometimes reveals hidden weaknesses. Hidden weaknesses. The capacitor bank had been operating within safe margins for years until the margins were moved. Then the question reached the executive level. I didn't hear it directly. It was relayed through someone who still respected my work. The CEO, after reviewing the cascading incidents, asked a simple thing: who built the original failsafes, not who designed the algorithm. Not who approved the compression strategy, who built the failsafes. That question carries weight in a manufacturing plant, because failsafes don't exist for optimism. They exist for inevitability. The answer was obvious, and for the first time since my badge hit that conference table, I sensed the shift, not a full reversal, just the faintest recognition that heat doesn't lie. And neither do the people who've spent decades learning how to manage it. Panic in a factory doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like spreadsheets after the capacitor rupture and the mounting downtime costs. Corporate did what corporate always does. When money bleeds too visibly, they called for an internal audit, not a symbolic review, a formal one. Access logs, authorization chains, configuration changes, approval timestamps, the kind of forensic sweep that doesn't care about charisma. I wasn't in the building, but I could feel the shift. The tone changed from defensive to procedural. When accounting starts asking for logs instead of explanations, someone is already being measured for blame. The audit team began with the motor failure on line 2. They traced the smart load compression rollout. They compared baseline settings with post-implementation changes. They pulled the override records. There it was. Derek had manually authorized the phase override that bypassed the automatic revert recommendation. It wasn't a system glitch. It wasn't a random anomaly. It was a decision. Then they examined the thermal ceiling adjustment. The log clearly showed a parameter increase from 92 degrees Celsius to 105. Not an AI adaptation, a manual configuration change. 2 protective layers had been disabled intentionally: the thermal ceiling and the secondary load balancing buffer. Those weren't coding relics. They were safeguards I designed after actual failures. By the second day of the audit, Derek's language shifted. According to someone still sympathetic enough to update me, he began describing my original configuration as overly conservative and legacy-bound. He claimed the architecture was outdated and constrained optimization potential. Outdated configuration. That phrase floated around executive emails like it explained physics. The auditors didn't debate philosophy. They read data. Every override required credential authentication. Every configuration change required a confirmation click. The audit trail documented not only the changes, but the explicit acknowledgments attached to them. Authorized by deep Vaughn, twice. When the audit team cross-referenced the timing of those overrides with the motor burnout and capacitor rupture, the pattern wasn't ambiguous. A warning had been generated. A safeguard had recommended reversion. The safeguard was silenced. What began as a modernization initiative now looked like a sequence of deliberate risk escalations. By the third day, Derek's confidence reportedly hardened into defensiveness. He insisted the instability stemmed from legacy structural fragility. He implied that my framework masked underlying inefficiencies and that removing constraints merely exposed weaknesses. It was almost impressive how quickly arrogance can rebrand itself as strategic insight. But audit teams don't accept narratives. They accept documentation. That's when they found the email, buried in a thread sent late the evening after my termination, addressed to IT leadership and carbon copied to 2 operations managers. Subject system cleanup. In the body. One line stood out: remove Joanne's safety ceiling. Not refactor. Not evaluate. Remove. There was no ambiguity, no cautious phrasing, no conditional language. The timestamp predated the thermal limit increase by hours. The auditors added it to their report. Once written language enters an audit file, it becomes permanent. You can explain a dashboard fluctuation. You can debate algorithm tuning. It's harder to reinterpret a direct instruction that eliminates a named safeguard. By the end of the review cycle, the tone in the building had changed again. Not panic, not yet. Pressure. When leadership shifts from innovation narratives to liability containment, the walls close in. I heard later that Derek tried to frame the email as process simplification. He argued that safety logic should be embedded in AI, not hard-coded manually. He spoke about modernization philosophy, but philosophy doesn't override timestamps. The audit trail didn't accuse him emotionally. It simply laid out cause and effect in chronological order. Manual override. Thermal ceiling removed. Secondary buffer disabled. Equipment failure. Shutdown. Sequence matters. For the first time since I left, the conversation wasn't about outdated systems. It was about accountability. And accountability is a narrow hallway. There isn't much room to maneuver once you're in it. The call came the way storms do, after days of pressure, sudden, inevitable, and oddly calm. I was standing in my kitchen when my phone lit up with the company's main line. I didn't rush to answer it. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. There's a difference between being needed and being convenient. I had been convenient for 27 years. On the 4th ring, I picked up Joanne. The CEO said, his voice measured but tight around the edges. No small talk, no pleasantries. We need to discuss the system. Of course we did. I leaned against the counter and watched the afternoon light stretch across the floor. I didn't ask what happened. I already knew. The audit trail had cornered Derek. The equipment failures had cornered the budget, and silence had cornered leadership. I'm retired, I said evenly. But I consult. There was a pause on the other end. Not shock calculation. We're prepared to discuss terms. He replied. This wasn't desperation, not yet. It was containment. The board had likely seen the preliminary audit findings. The phrase "remove Joanne's safety ceiling" had probably been read out loud in a room with glass walls and controlled voices. I kept my tone neutral. My rate is triple what I was earning. I said, 6-month retainer, paid up front for the first quarter. Another pause. Paper shifting. Someone else breathing in the background. And, I continued, before he could respond, full authority over system-level decisions. No parameter changes. No overrides. No modernization directives without my sign-off. If you want optimization, we do it safely, or we don't do it. The words weren't emotional. They didn't need to be. Power doesn't shout when it knows it's justified. He didn't argue the rate. He didn't negotiate the timeline. He didn't ask for a discount. He asked one question. How soon can you come in? That's when I understood the scope. It wasn't about $70,000 anymore, or $210,000 in downtime. It was about structural confidence. Investors don't panic over isolated failures. They panic over patterns. I'll need a formal agreement drafted. I said, and written acknowledgement that I report directly to you on system governance. That can be arranged. He answered without hesitation. There it was, the shift. For years, I had sat in rooms explaining thermal ceilings and phase alignment to executives who nodded politely before prioritizing quarterly optics. Now the same room needed stability more than speed. I'll review the draft tonight, I said. If it reflects what we discussed, I can be there tomorrow. Joanne, he added before hanging up, we appreciate your willingness to help. Willingness. I didn't correct him. I didn't need appreciation. I needed clarity. After the call ended, I set the phone down gently, not triumphantly, not angrily, just deliberately, for the first time since my badge hit that table. The leverage had shifted. They weren't calling because they respected legacy. They were calling because the numbers forced them to, and that's fine. Respect born of necessity is still respect. Later that evening, the draft contract arrived in my inbox. Triple rate confirmed. 6-month retainer confirmed. Executive reporting line confirmed. No clauses limiting authority over system safeguards. They didn't negotiate. They accepted. I signed it the next morning. Not because I missed the building, but because the building missed balance. And balance is something you don't appreciate until it's gone. When I walked back in the next day, I wouldn't be legacy overhead. I would be the architect. And this time, the keys would stay with me. When I walked back into the building, no one applauded. Good. Applause is emotional. I needed clarity. The plant smelled the same metal, coolant, faint ozone, but the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations lowered when I passed. Not out of pity, out of recalculation. I wasn't the dismissed engineer anymore. I was the contingency plan. The CEO met me briefly, nodded once, and led me straight to the executive conference room. Derek was already there, so were 2 board members, legal counsel, and IT. No theatrics. Let's understand what happened. The CEO said. I didn't sit at the far end of the table. I connected my laptop to the main display. First slide load distribution map. Not the AI dashboard Derek loved, the raw electrical trace. Phase angles, thermal curves, real data. I want to be clear. I began evenly. This wasn't sabotage. Derek leaned back slightly, arms folded. He looked tired but defiant. The AI didn't malfunction. I continued. It executed the parameters it was given. I pulled up the smart load compression configuration file. This is the baseline compression target, I said, highlighting the load threshold. This value determines how aggressively current is redistributed during peak suppression. Silence. Then, I overlaid the thermal ceiling variable, originally capped at 92 degrees Celsius. That limit was designed after 3 historical overload events. I tapped the keyboard and the value changed on screen. 105. The room shifted. That adjustment widened tolerance margins beyond safe insulation decay thresholds. Derek spoke for the first time. You manipulated the baseline, he said sharply. The initial configuration was flawed. We corrected it. I didn't respond emotionally. I clicked to the next graph. A waveform appeared before and after parameter change. This is the motor on line 2. I said. Phase deviation begins here. The system flags inconsistency. Reversion protocol initiates. I zoomed in. Manual override halts correction. The board member on the right leaned forward. Who authorized that override? I didn't answer verbally. I expanded the event log. Authorized by D. Vaughn. Derek shifted in his seat. That doesn't prove intent, he said. We were optimizing performance. I agree, I replied calmly. You were optimizing. I switched to the capacitor rupture data. When the thermal ceiling was raised, the capacitor cluster absorbed irregular surges within expanded tolerance. The AI interpreted the temperature as acceptable because you redefined acceptable. Another overlay, with the secondary load balancing buffer disabled. There was no soft redistribution. I let the silence settle. This system did exactly what it was told to do. No one interrupted. AI doesn't sabotage. I continued. It obeys. Derek's jaw tightened. "You're implying the architecture was fragile," he said. "That's not a modernization issue, that's structural." I opened the configuration archive. I anticipated that argument. I said, "The screen displayed the original safety matrix timestamped, version controlled." Then I opened the change request file. Electronic signature verified D. Vaughn. Date stamped. Parameter adjustment, thermal sealing modification. Secondary buffer disablement. Override authorization. The legal counsel leaned closer to the display. Derek's voice hardened. "You're presenting selective data." "No," I said evenly. "I'm presenting complete data." I toggled the version history panel. The AI's baseline learning model did not change. The system integrity did not degrade. The only variables modified were the safety constraints and manual override permissions. I stepped away from the screen. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't legacy instability. It wasn't outdated hardware. I met Derek's eyes. It was confidence exceeding constraint. The CEO exhaled slowly. Derek tried once more. "You're framing this to protect your own design. I don't need to protect it." I replied, "The logs protect it." Then I brought up the final document, an email attachment, configuration approval, smart load compression phase 2. Signed electronically? D. Vaughn. The board member read it silently. "You approved the ceiling change," he said to Derek. "It was part of modernization strategy." Derek insisted. "Yes," I answered quietly. "And modernization requires accountability." The room fell still, again not hostile, not dramatic, measured. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him of recklessness. I didn't need to. Data doesn't shout, it stands, for years. I had built systems assuming human error would eventually occur. That's why fail-safes exist, not because people are malicious, because they are ambitious. The AI wasn't wrong. The hardware wasn't weak. The system didn't betray anyone. It obeyed its instructions, and the instructions were his. When I closed my laptop, the narrative had shifted permanently, not from blame to revenge, from speculation to proof. Cold proof. By the time the technical evidence settled, the room had grown quieter, but not safer. Data can corner someone. Contracts can finish the job. I didn't reopen my laptop immediately. I let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to believe the presentation was over. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin, neatly tabbed folder. "There's one more thing," I said calmly. Derek's shoulders tightened. The CEO watched me carefully. Legal leaned forward. "When I rebuilt the load distribution framework after the 2009 thermal incident, the company declined to purchase a third-party grid management suite. It was deemed too expensive at the time." That was true. The licensing fee had been substantial. So instead, I built a custom core architecture, not just code an integrated energy load model calibrated to that specific facility. It was faster, cheaper, and tailored to the plant. I continued, but it came with one condition. I slid the document across the table. Intellectual property ownership. The legal counsel opened the folder. He read the highlighted clause silently. 12 years earlier, the previous CEO had signed an agreement acknowledging that the energy load core architecture, the foundational balancing system beneath every dashboard and compression routine, remained my intellectual property. It was licensed to the company for $1 per year, renewable annually, contingent upon my employment status. If my employment ended, the license terminated immediately. Derek blinked. "That's not enforceable," he said too quickly. The lawyer didn't respond to him. He kept reading. "I didn't charge market rate," I added evenly, "because I believed in the team, but I protected authorship." I folded my hands on the table. When my position was eliminated, the license ended. The CEO's expression shifted. For 4 days after my termination, the plant operated using proprietary architecture without an active license. Silence. The legal counsel adjusted his glasses. "That would constitute unauthorized use," he said carefully. Derek leaned forward. "That's absurd. The company paid her salary for years." That covers it. No, I said calmly. Salary compensated operational responsibility. The architecture license was separate. I tapped the document. It's explicit. The counsel flipped to the signature page. The former CEO's name was there, dated and notarized. The room didn't erupt, it compressed. Corporate law isn't dramatic, it's procedural, and procedure has weight. Derek tried again. Even if that's technically accurate, she didn't disable the system. She didn't block access. I didn't need to. I replied, I didn't sabotage anything. The system continued running exactly as configured, but legally. The architecture was unlicensed the moment I was removed. The CEO exhaled slowly. How exposed are we? He asked the lawyer. The lawyer chose his words carefully, if challenged. The damages would likely equal the commercial valuation of proprietary energy management software in an industrial setting, which would not be $1. Derek's voice rose. This is retaliation. No, I answered quietly. It's structure. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't angry. I was steady. For years. I built fail-safes assuming equipment might fail. I also built contractual fail-safes assuming leadership might. That landed. The counsel closed the folder. She's correct, he said plainly. The agreement is valid. The license was contingent upon employment. It terminated upon dismissal. There it was. Confirmation. Not from me. From legal. The CEO rubbed his temple. So for 4 days, he said slowly, we operated without authorization. Yes, I replied. Unintentionally, but unlawfully. Derek looked between us. You're leveraging a technicality. No, I said evenly. You removed the architect without reviewing the foundation. There's a difference. The board members exchanged glances. This wasn't about ego anymore. It was about exposure, about investor confidence, about compliance risk. What are you proposing? The CEO asked. I'm already consulting, I said. We formalize a permanent licensing structure, clear authority over system modifications, no unilateral overrides. It wasn't revenge, it was governance. The legal counsel nodded slightly. That would mitigate risk. Derek sat back, visibly cornered now, not by heat curves or motor failures, but by paper, for years. I had protected that building from electrical overload. Today, I protected it from legal one. The difference was simple. Electricity burns immediately. Liability burns slowly. And unlike a motor, it doesn't make noise when it fails. Justice in a corporation doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives with spreadsheets. 72 hours after the motor failure, the capacitor rupture, and the missed shipment. The board convened in the glass conference room overlooking the production floor. The plant was running again, barely stable. Carefully monitored, but the atmosphere in that room had nothing to do with machinery. It had to do with arithmetic. I stood at the front with a single slide displayed. No dramatic animations, no red warning banners, just numbers. Over the last 72 hours. I began evenly. The plant incurred the following direct losses. I clicked once. $70,000. Replacement cost for the Line 2 motor. Another click. $210,000 in cumulative downtime from shutdown events and restart sequencing. Another. $95,000 in contractual penalty exposure for the delayed Ford shipment. Final click. $18,000 in emergency repairs and expedited component sourcing. I paused. Total confirmed impact $393,000. No one interrupted. No one needed to. The numbers didn't accuse. They didn't exaggerate. They simply existed. I stepped aside slightly so the board could view the full summary table, including timestamps, override authorizations, and correlated parameter adjustments. Derek sat halfway down the table, posture rigid but controlled. He wasn't sweating. He wasn't shouting. He looked like someone preparing to defend a strategy. The CEO spoke first. Derek, he said quietly, walk us through your decision process. It wasn't an attack. It was an invitation. Derek cleared his throat. The Smart Load Compression Initiative was designed to modernize an outdated infrastructure. The legacy configuration limited performance margins and masked inefficiencies. The initial motor failure was attributable to aging hardware, not the algorithm. He gestured toward my slide. The capacitor event revealed structural fragility that predated modernization. These losses represent transitional friction. Transitional friction. It was a clean phrase, almost elegant. One board member leaned forward. And the manual override, Derek hesitated only briefly. The algorithm was being overly conservative. We intervened to maintain compression targets. The CEO's eyes shifted to me. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him mid-sentence. I waited. When Derek finished, I spoke calmly. The motor failure occurred within seconds of a manual phase override that halted a recommended system reversion. The thermal sealing increase directly expanded tolerance thresholds beyond previously validated insulation limits. The secondary load balancing buffer was disabled prior to the packaging outage. I let the silence absorb it. These were not automated deviations. They were parameter adjustments. Derek's jaw tightened. We were optimizing. He repeated. Yes, I said. You were. The CEO folded his hands. Did anyone advise against these changes? Kevin from IT shifted in his seat. I raised concerns about the sealing modification, he said carefully. And about removing the buffer? The board member nearest the window asked. Were those concerns documented? Yes, Kevin replied. In email. The CEO didn't look surprised. He looked tired. Derek, he said, voice steady. Did you authorize removal of the safety sealing? Derek exhaled slowly. Yes, as part of modernization. And did you authorize the manual override? Yes. There it was. No ambiguity left to parse. The board didn't react dramatically. No one slammed a fist. No one accused him of negligence. That's not how corporate justice works. It accumulates. The CEO looked at the financial summary again. $393,000 in 72 hours, he said quietly. And reputational exposure. He leaned back in his chair. For clarity, he continued. If the fail-safes had remained intact, would these losses have occurred? I answered simply. No, not emotionally, not triumphantly, just no. The room settled into a different kind of silence, one where the outcome had already been calculated. The CEO turned toward Derek. We hired you to improve performance, he said. Not to dismantle safeguards without validation? Derek began to respond. But the CEO raised a hand. This is not about modernization philosophy, it's about risk management. Another pause. Then the words landed. Turn in your badge. No anger, no raised voice, no dramatic exit, just instruction. Derek blinked, as if the sentence required processing time. Effective immediately. The CEO added. No one applauded. No one smiled. Corporate justice isn't loud, it's administrative. Derek stood slowly, for a moment. He looked like he might argue again. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed his badge on the table. The same table where mine had once rested. Symmetry has a way of finding its own balance. As he walked out of the room, no one followed him. The board turned their attention back to me, not as a victor, not as a rival, but as the architect of a system that had just proven its own necessity. $393,000 is a large number, but the real cost wasn't financial. It was the illusion that constraints are weakness. And in that room, quietly and without spectacle, that illusion ended. There's something poetic about symmetry, especially in corporate rooms where time is currency and silence is leverage. 3 days earlier, Derek had stood in that same executive space and implied I had 10 seconds to justify my existence, 10 seconds to defend decades of systems thinking against a slide deck, 10 seconds to survive optimization. Now the room was rearranged, but the clock on the wall hadn't moved. The board session hadn't fully adjourned after the financial summary. Derek had been instructed to surrender his badge, but he lingered half-seated, half-standing as if waiting for a final appeal opportunity. Corporate exits are rarely theatrical. They are procedural. But ego doesn't dissolve that quickly. The CEO remained seated at the head of the table. His expression wasn't angry. It was settled. "Derek," he said evenly, glancing at his watch. "You have 10 seconds." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. 10 seconds to explain why nearly $400,000 evaporated in 72 hours. 10 seconds to justify disabling documented safeguards. 10 seconds to reconcile modernization rhetoric with measurable loss. The irony was precise. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, adjusted his posture. This was a strategic initiative. He began. Voice thinner than before. Short-term volatility. The CEO raised a hand slightly. 10 seconds. The room went still. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't enjoy it visibly. Satisfaction doesn't require spectacle. It requires completion. Derek glanced around the table, as if looking for an ally. There wasn't one. The audit trail had been explicit. The financial impact undeniable. Legal exposure documented. No one wanted to attach their credibility to his defense. "This environment requires innovation," he said. Words accelerating now. "If we're punished for modernization risk, we'll stagnate." That was 8 seconds. The CEO's gaze didn't waver. "And who absorbs the risk?" he asked quietly. There was no answer. The final seconds stretched long enough to feel deliberate. 10. The CEO lowered his wrist. "This is not about innovation," he said calmly. "It is about gross negligence." The phrase landed with more weight than any raised voice could have carried. Gross negligence, not miscalculation, not transition error, not strategic friction, negligence. Derek's posture finally collapsed inward. The confidence that once framed every sentence had drained out, replaced by something closer to disbelief. "I disagree with that characterization," he muttered. "You're entitled to," the CEO replied. "But the board is not obligated to share it." The legal counsel slid a document across the table. "Termination notice, effective immediately. Cause specified." Derek signed it without further argument. No slammed doors, no dramatic exit, just paperwork. I remained standing near the display screen, hands loosely folded. Not triumphant, not vindictive. Still, there's a difference between revenge and restoration. Revenge is emotional. Restoration is structural. This wasn't about humiliating him. It was about restoring guardrails to a system that had nearly been stripped of them. As Derek gathered his belongings, the CEO addressed the room. "Risk-taking is not reckless," he said, "but removing fail-safes without validation is." He turned toward me, briefly, not to praise, but to acknowledge. "Systems exist to protect performance," he continued, "and the people who design them deserve authority." The meeting dissolved quietly after that. Directors filed out with folders under their arms. Legal remained behind to finalize documentation. I walked toward the window overlooking the production floor. Machines were running again, stable, balanced, predictable. No sparks, no alarms, just controlled motion. Later that afternoon, corporate communications released a carefully worded statement about leadership restructuring and recommitment to operational discipline. By market close, the stock ticked upward, 3%. 3% isn't dramatic in absolute terms, but in a publicly traded industrial firm, it signals confidence. Investors don't reward drama, they reward stability. The board had removed volatility. As I left the building that evening, no one stopped me. No one congratulated me. They didn't need to. 10 seconds once defined my supposed redundancy. 10 seconds later defined his accountability. The symmetry wasn't loud. It was precise. And sometimes, precision is the most satisfying outcome of all. Balance returned the way it always does, quietly, without applause. 2 weeks after the board meeting, my title changed officially to Chief Systems Architect. It wasn't ceremonial. It was structural. The new contract placed system governance under my direct authority. No parameter shifts, no override permissions, no modernization initiatives without documented review and my signature attached. Not because I demanded control, Because the board finally understood what control actually protects. The first thing I did wasn't flashy. I reinstated the thermal ceiling at 92 degrees Celsius. I restored the secondary load balancing buffer. I audited every compression parameter line by line. Efficiency targets remained, but within validated tolerances. Optimization isn't reckless when it's grounded. I also pulled Kevin and 2 junior engineers into the control room. Watch the phase alignment here, I told them, overlaying live distribution maps on the screen. Dashboards show trends, systems show stress. Learn the difference. They listened, not because I was louder, because I was proven over the next month. Uptime stabilized beyond pre-incident levels, not through aggression, through discipline. The AI remained active, but now it operated within guardrails instead of ego. Derek's old office didn't stay empty for long. At my suggestion, it was converted into a technician break room, better lighting, decent coffee, proper seating. The people who keep machines running deserved comfort more than the people who theorized about them. Justice in a corporation isn't about punishment, it's about correction. As for me, I no longer defend my value in meetings. My work does that quietly. Every time a motor runs cool under peak demand, I look out over the floor now with something I didn't feel before. Autonomy. Legacy doesn't mean old, it means tested. And when you fire the architect, don't be surprised if the building shakes. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I understood the system better than the person trying to control it. That's the real lesson here. Skill is quiet, experience is invisible, and sometimes the only proof of your value is what breaks when you're gone. What hurt the most wasn't being fired, it was being dismissed. But restraint matters. Documentation matters. Structure matters. If you ever find yourself in a room where your work is reduced to a line item, ask yourself, will you react emotionally, or will you let the results speak? This story isn't about revenge. It's about boundaries. It's about knowing your worth without announcing it every 5 minutes. It's about protecting what you build even when someone calls it outdated. And maybe the hardest question is this: if you were in that seat, would you protect your integrity first? Or your pride? I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? What's happening in your world as you hear this? If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. Not for me, but for the person who might need to hear it next. A single like, a thoughtful comment, or a share could reach someone standing in their own version of that boardroom. Sometimes doing the right thing starts with amplifying the right story. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.